A Chinese tugboat just appeared next to a rusting World War II warship that's been deliberately grounded in contested waters for 25 years. Beijing wants it gone. Manila says that's an act of war. And here's what nobody's telling you about why this could trigger World War III. The tugboat showed up without warning. Chinese Navy vessels don't just appear anywhere by accident, especially not 105 nautical miles from the Philippines coast, circling around what looks like a shipwreck but is actually the most strategically important piece of metal in the South China Sea. The BRP Sierra Madre sits grounded on 2nd Thomas Shoal, slowly rusting away while Filipino Marines live aboard in cramped quarters, maintaining one of the most precarious military outposts on Earth. But when that Chinese tugboat materialized nearby in August 2024, it wasn't just another harassment operation. This was different. Tugboats have one primary function. They move things, big things, heavy things, things like grounded warships. Philippine Navy officials immediately went into crisis mode. Armed Forces, Chief Romeo Bronner Jr. issued stark orders to troops stationed aboard the Sierra Madre. Stop any attempt by Chinese personnel to board the ship at all costs. The phrase "at all costs" doesn't appear in routine military communications. It appears when someone's about to cross a line that can't be uncrossed. But here's where it gets terrifying. And this is the retention bomb I promised you. The Chinese tugboat didn't just show up randomly. Intelligence sources suggest this was a reconnaissance mission, testing Philippine responses and measuring the ship's vulnerability to removal, because Beijing has been building toward this moment for months, orchestrating the most aggressive harassment campaign in the shoal's 25-year history. What happened next? The tugboat mysteriously vanished after Philippine forces made it clear they would defend the ship with lethal force. But the message was sent. The question isn't whether China wants to remove the Sierra Madre. It's whether they've finally figured out how to do it without starting a war they're not ready for. And that brings us to the ship itself, because most people have no idea what this vessel actually represents, or why Beijing is so desperate to make it disappear. The Sierra Madre wasn't supposed to be a symbol of anything. It was supposed to be scrap metal, built during World War II as USS LST-821. This tank landing ship carried American forces through some of the Pacific's bloodiest battles. After the war, it served in Vietnam as USS Harnett County, ferrying troops and supplies through hostile waters. By the 1970s, when the Philippines acquired it, the vessel was already approaching obsolescence. But in 1999, something extraordinary happened. Vice Admiral Eduardo Santos, then chief of the Philippine Navy, hatched one of the most audacious military strategies in modern history. Instead of decommissioning the aging warship, he ordered it to steam towards 2nd Thomas Shoal and deliberately run aground. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a navigation error. This was a calculated act of defiance against China's growing territorial ambitions in the South China Sea. Why 2nd Thomas Shoal? Location is everything in geopolitics. The shoal sits squarely within the Philippines' 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, as defined by international law. It's 105 nautical miles from Palawan, close enough to resupply, far enough to be vulnerable. But most importantly, it's surrounded by some of the world's richest fishing grounds and sits atop potentially massive oil and gas reserves. China had just occupied Mischief Reef, demonstrating their willingness to seize disputed territory through fait accompli. The Philippines faced a choice: watch their maritime territory disappear piece by piece, or do something dramatic enough to force the world to pay attention. They chose drama. The Sierra Madre became an instant military outpost, its presence transforming an empty reef into a contested flashpoint. Filipino Marines began rotating through the ship in small detachments, living in conditions that would make a submarine crew claustrophobic. But here's what makes this strategy brilliant. As long as the Sierra Madre remains a commissioned vessel of the Philippine Navy, it's protected by international maritime law. Attacking it would be an act of war against a sovereign nation. Moving it without permission would be piracy on the high seas. For 25 years, this legal shield has held. But shields can be tested, and China has been testing it with increasing aggression. 2024 became the year everything changed. If you've been following South China Sea tensions casually, you might think this is just another routine confrontation between neighbors. You'd be catastrophically wrong. The data tells a different story. Chinese forces used kinetic force against Philippine vessels at least 10 times during resupply missions over the past few years. But in 2024, something shifted. The attacks became more frequent, more violent, and more coordinated. March 2024, Chinese Coast Guard ships unleashed water cannons against Philippine vessels with unprecedented intensity, causing what officials described as heavy damages. These weren't warning shots. Water cannons at close range can shatter windows, injure crew members, and disable navigation equipment. June 2024, the gloves came off entirely. Chinese Coast Guard personnel physically boarded Philippine vessels during a resupply mission, injured 8 Filipino sailors, and created the most dangerous standoff at Second Thomas Shoal since the ship was grounded. For several hours, the world teetered on the edge of the first naval battle between major powers in decades. But here's what the media missed. Despite using force repeatedly, China has only succeeded in blocking supplies to the Sierra Madre twice since 1999. November 2021 and June 2024. That's a 90% failure rate for one of the world's most advanced military forces. Why? Because the Philippines developed something China didn't expect. A rotation and resupply system called RORE that's nearly impossible to stop without committing an outright act of war. The Uniza May 4th, a civilian resupply vessel, became the lifeline keeping Filipino Marines alive on their deteriorating outpost. Every few months, this ship would attempt to reach the Sierra Madre carrying food, water, medical supplies, and fresh personnel. Chinese vessels would intercept, harass, and attack, but international law protected the mission. Then came July 2024. After the June boarding incident nearly triggered a shooting war, both sides agreed to a temporary understanding, allowing routine resupply missions. China called it face-saving diplomacy. The Philippines called it victory. But temporary understandings have a way of becoming permanently ignored when tugboats start appearing uninvited. The question everyone's asking: what happens when China decides harassment isn't enough? This isn't really about a rusting ship on a remote reef. This is about redrawing the map of the world's most important waterway. $3.37 trillion in trade passes through the South China Sea annually. That's roughly equivalent to the entire GDP of Germany flowing through these contested waters every single year. Whoever controls this sea controls global commerce. China's strategy is elegantly simple. Establish facts on the water, then dare the world to do something about it. They've already transformed 7 reefs into artificial islands bristling with military equipment. They've deployed Coast Guard vessels the size of frigates. They've created a maritime militia that looks like fishing boats but coordinates like a naval fleet. The Sierra Madre represents the last major obstacle to this strategy. As long as that ship sits on Second Thomas Shoal, China cannot claim de facto control over the area. As long as Filipino Marines live aboard, the Philippines maintains a legal presence that international law recognizes. Remove the ship, and the entire house of cards collapses. But the Philippines hasn't been sitting idle. They've constructed one of the most sophisticated deterrent strategies in modern military history, built on 3 pillars that make attacking the Sierra Madre exponentially more dangerous than China initially calculated. Pillar 1, legal warfare. The 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling demolished China's 9-line claims and affirmed Philippine sovereignty over their exclusive economic zone. While Beijing refuses to recognize the ruling, every other nation on Earth does. This means removing the Sierra Madre wouldn't just be an attack on the Philippines. It would be an assault on the entire international legal order. Pillar 2, alliance leverage. The Philippines-US Mutual Defense Treaty means any attack on Philippine military assets could trigger American intervention. But here's what makes this particularly dangerous for China. The US doesn't have to prove the attack was unprovoked or even significant. The treaty's Article 4 is intentionally broad, giving Washington maximum flexibility to respond. Meanwhile, regional allies have quietly positioned themselves as force multipliers. Japan provides Coast Guard support and intelligence sharing. Australia conducts joint patrols and freedom of navigation operations. European nations have increased naval presence and diplomatic support. Pillar 3, strategic transparency. Every Chinese harassment operation gets documented, publicized, and broadcast to the world. The Philippines turned their weakness into strength by making every confrontation a global news event. China thrives in shadows and ambiguity. They struggle when every move gets international scrutiny. This 3-pillar strategy has held for years, but strategies can be countered, and China's been working on their counter-moves. The technical question isn't whether China can remove the Sierra Madre, it's whether they can do it without triggering consequences they're not prepared to face. Let's start with the engineering challenge. The Sierra Madre has been grounded for 25 years. That's 25 years of coral growth, sediment accumulation, and structural integration with the reef itself. The ship isn't just sitting on the shoal, it's becoming part of it. A tugboat, even a military-grade vessel, faces enormous challenges. First, there's the question of attachment points. The Sierra Madre is deteriorating, meaning traditional towing connections might simply tear away under stress. Second, there's depth and angle. The ship is grounded at specific points that would require precise lifting or dredging operations, not something you can do quickly or quietly. Then there's weather. The South China Sea experiences monsoon seasons that create massive swells and dangerous conditions. Any removal operation would need to occur during narrow weather windows, giving the Philippines advance warning and time to respond. But the real obstacles aren't technical, they're human. Filipino Marines live aboard the Sierra Madre in rotating detachments. They're armed, trained, and under explicit orders to defend their position. Any attempt to board or remove the ship would require dealing with them first. That's not harassment or gray zone warfare. That's combat between military forces. The moment Chinese personnel engage Filipino troops, everything changes. The Philippines would invoke their mutual defense treaty with the United States. American forces in the region would face enormous pressure to respond. Regional allies would choose sides. Here's the scenario that keeps military planners awake at night. A Chinese tugboat begins towing operations. Filipino Marines fire warning shots. Chinese forces return fire to protect their operation. Filipino Marines are killed or wounded. At that point, you have dead soldiers, violated sovereignty, and alliance obligations triggered simultaneously. The escalation ladder becomes almost impossible to control. But wait, there's something even more dangerous than direct confrontation, and China might have found it. China has mastered operating in the gray zone, between peace and war. But the Sierra Madre is binary. It's either there or not, Philippine or not. This forces China into uncomfortable choices: escalate to direct action and risk war, or accept permanent Philippine presence. Chinese strategists may have found a third option: waiting for natural collapse. The 80-year-old ship deteriorates rapidly in harsh conditions. China's calculation: maintain harassment to prevent repairs, while natural forces destroy the ship from within. Once uninhabitable, international pressure could force evacuation for humanitarian reasons. Then China could argue the empty hulk poses navigation hazards, justifying removal under maritime law. The Philippines are playing deeper too. Former Navy Chief Santos advocates legal pressure, alliance building, and strategic transparency over reinforcement attempts. It's a race. Will the Sierra Madre collapse before China's isolation becomes unbearable? Chinese vessel deployments of 10 to 15 ships suggest major operations. Accelerated Philippine resupply missions indicate expected escalation. Increased U.S. naval activity signals deterrence commitment. The timeline matters. All factors are aligning to make the next 12 to 18 months critical for the South China Sea's future. The Sierra Madre isn't just a ship. It's a 25-year experiment in whether international law can restrain superpower ambitions, whether Filipino Marines living in a rusting hull can outlast Chinese pressure campaigns, whether alliance systems built after World War II can adapt to gray zone warfare in the 21st century. For 2.5 decades, this unlikely vessel has held the line against forces that seemed inevitable. Every successful resupply mission is a small victory for the principle that presence matters, that sovereignty isn't just about military power, and that even the smallest nations can defend their rights when they choose their battles wisely. The appearance of that Chinese tugboat wasn't just another harassment operation. It was Beijing testing whether they've finally found a way to solve their Sierra Madre problem without triggering the consequences they've spent 25 years trying to avoid. Whether they have or not, we'll know soon enough. But what we already know is this: the stakes couldn't be higher, the players couldn't be more committed, and the margin for error couldn't be smaller. The next chapter of this story will determine whether the international order bends to force or holds firm against pressure, whether tugboats can succeed where water cannons have failed, whether a weathered hull and a handful of determined Marines can continue defying one of the world's most powerful militaries. If you found this deep dive as gripping as I did researching it, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell icon, because this story is far from over, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment below. Do Do you think China will actually attempt to remove the Sierra Madre? Or is this just another round of brinksmanship? And share this video with anyone who needs to understand why a rusting World War II ship might be the most important piece of metal on Earth right now.